please clarify specifically, have you taken a cognitive test?
No, I haven't taken a test. Why the hell would I take a test? Come on, man. That's like saying you, before you got in this program, you take a test where you're taking cocaine or not. What do you think, huh? Are you a junkie?
What do you say to President Trump, who brags about his test and makes your mental state an issue for voters?
Well, if he can't figure out the difference between an elephant and a lion, I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
Vice President Joe Biden trying to make some point, talking to CBS journalist Errol Barnett there, asking if he should have taken a cocaine test before that interview.
What point's he trying to make? What's he doing, man?
I wish I could help you.
Yeah, I mean, you could just say yes or no there.
Yeah, no, I don't need to take a test. Yeah, well, so Joe Biden, that was a couple of days ago. Now today, clarifying remarks he made after suggesting the Latino community is more diverse than the black community. President Trump wrote about these comments on Twitter, posting, "Joe Biden just lost the entire African-American community. What a dumb thing to say." But the president only...
Wait, Mr. Charlottesville said that he's lost the entire... Did he really say that, Willie?
He wrote it down.
Because I was working on our science project yesterday. Did he really say the man who had David Duke praising him for his moral equivalency with Nazis and protesters? Did he really say that he lost the entire African-American community?
Yes, while you were putting the Mentos in the 2-liter Coke bottle, he did, in fact, write that in a tweet. It does? Okay. There you go.
It blows up your... I got some video coming.
He wrote that in a tweet. By the way, this is also the guy who a few days ago said to Jonathan Swan of the life and legacy of civil rights icon John Lewis, he didn't come to my inauguration. That was his assessment, and said, I've done more for black people than any president besides, perhaps, he said, Abraham Lincoln. Meanwhile, the president, though, included only part of the former vice president's exchange. Biden first made the distinction about diversity during a virtual conference of black and Hispanic journalists. The interview with NPR's Lulu Garcia Navarro was taped Wednesday and aired yesterday. Watch.
Are you going to re-engage with Cuba, though? I mean, I'm specifically wondering about, the Florida communities that are, incredibly interested in the Cuba issue and see status given to Venezuelans while Cubans are being deported.
The answer is yes. I'm going to engage. Yes. Yes. And by the way, what you all know, but most people don't know, unlike the African-American community, with notable exceptions, the Latino community is an incredibly diverse community with incredibly different attitudes about different things. You go to Florida, you find a very different attitude about immigration in certain places than you do when you're in Arizona. So it's a very different, a very diverse community.
Unlike the African-American community, Vice President Biden said. Then, while addressing a group of Latino elected and appointed officials yesterday, the former vice president continued to make that argument.
We can build a new administration that reflects the full diversity of our nation and the full diversity of Latino communities. Now, when I mean full diversity, unlike the African-American community and many other communities, you're from everywhere, from Europe, from the tip of South America, all the way to our border in Mexico and in the Caribbean. And different backgrounds, different ethnicities, but all Latinos. We're going to get a chance to do that if we win in November.
So when the backlash hit last night, Vice President Biden sought to clarify his remarks. He tweeted this: "In no way did I mean to suggest the African-American community is a monolith, not by identity, not on issues, not at all. Throughout my career, I've witnessed the diversity of thought, background, and sentiment within the African-American community. It's this diversity that makes our workplaces, communities, and country a better place. My commitment to you is this: I will always listen. I will never stop fighting for the African-American community, and I will never stop fighting for a more equitable future." But Joe, his point was clear, and he made it twice, that the Latino community has more diversity within itself than does the African-American community.
Guess what? If you're just looking politically, it does. It does. I'm more concerned by the cocaine comment than actually Joe Biden analyzing the political backgrounds of groups. Victoria, my complaint of Democrats over the past decade has been, and we've said it on this show, they seem to think of the Latino community as this monolith of voters. But yes, Cuban voters in Miami have a radically different political viewpoint on the whole. Say Puerto Rico voters in Central Florida or Mexican voters in parts of Texas. The Democrats in the past have looked at the Latino community as a monolith, and I think that's been a great mistake. You look at the black community like evangelicals, politically at least, usually every 4 years, 85, 86, 87% of black voters will vote for the Democratic candidate. In the Hispanic community, I think George Bush got 42, 43, 44% of the Hispanic vote, but Trump and Romney got down in the low 20s. So I think Joe Biden made that, perhaps he made that argument inartfully. He didn't need to include the African-American community in the discussion. But the bigger point is he does seem to recognize that the Latino community is not one giant monolithic community, that it is it's varied and it's a diverse community politically.
So I completely understand what Vice President Joe Biden was trying to say. But as you said, Joe, he said it incredibly inartfully. And the point here is really about Latinos having additional dimensions of diversity than, say, other groups in the United States. And the two main dimensions, Joe, are country of origin. Latinos come from all over Latin America, Cuba, from Mexico, from Peru, and also in terms of generation. But I think when we're talking about the electorate, the real line of division and the one that really matters at the polls is the country of origin and the story that brought you here. Because what we see in Florida is that we saw a lot of folks who were fleeing the communist regime. And when they get to the United States, they have a very strong sentiment against the Castro regime and against Cuba. And that's what has ultimately driven them to the Republican Party and what has formed that very strong base that Trump has. And Trump knows it. 20% of voters, of eligible voters in Florida, are Latinos. He is going after that vote extremely aggressively. And on the flip side, Joe, Biden knows he's soft with some segments of the Latino population. He knows that Sanders beat him handily during the primary. He knows that Latinos also have a segment of conservatism, of pro-lifeness that is separate from Cuba. He knows that his name recognition isn't as high as it should be. He knows Latinos don't turn out as they should be. So there is a lot for Joe Biden to be worried about. And these inartful comments are just not helping in a time when he needs everything he can to boost that Latino turnout and to get Latinos to come over to his side.
Yeah, Gene Robinson, I'm curious what your take is on Joe Biden's comments. And yes, I think they may have been inartful, but it's the first time that the Democrats, that I've heard a national Democratic leader actually say what he's been saying, because, again, my criticism of the Democratic Party over the past decade or so is that they have naturally assumed that just because there's a growing Hispanic population, that's somehow going to lead to beneficial political outcomes. It's not that way. And let me say it. The Hispanic community, the Latino community, is far more diverse than other demographic groups, whether you're talking politically, whether you're talking about Black Americans who vote overwhelmingly for Democrats or white evangelicals who vote overwhelmingly for Republican candidates and conservative candidates, whether you talk about working class white men who have voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump in the past, or suburban college educated white women who are going to be voting disproportionately for Joe Biden most likely coming up this fall. So what's your take on all this, Gene?
Well, first, Joe, I wrote a whole book about how incredibly diverse the African American community is now, socially, culturally, economically, much more diverse than it was 50 or 60 years ago during the civil rights movement. However, there's one aspect in which the African American community really isn't very diverse at all, and that is political behavior. That is voting behavior. And since 1964, when Barry Goldwater, who opposed the Civil Rights Act, was running for president on the Republican ticket, since 1964, African Americans have voted roughly between 85% and 95% for the Democratic candidate. And just like clockwork, it just happens. And it's a perfectly rational reason. African Americans have perceived the Republican Party as hostile to African Americans' interests and aspirations, and with good reason, I would argue, and certainly in most of those elections. But that's just the way it is. So that point that Biden was making was, as you said, that's a valid point. About the Latino community, I think there may indeed be a tendency among some Democrats to see Latino as a political umbrella term in a way that it isn't. I would suggest that anyone with experience in Florida elections would immediately disabuse people of that notion, because yes, absolutely. But but Democrats have an advantage in the Trump era because of how hostile Trump has been on issues that are passionate, really important to many segments of that diverse Latino community. Immigration, for example, and not all Latinos see immigration in the same way, but there are many Latinos who are second generation, third generation, who do feel passionately about that issue, who watch what happened on the border with the separation of families and the caging of children in a way that felt very personal and made them very angry.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.